The leaders voted to exile Earth. Humanity left before the vote was over. The signal came in the middle of a funeral. Not a human funeral. A Vorath one, 3 days of silence, mandatory stillness, every light in the station dimmed to a single pale thread. The Vorath believed that noise disturbed the passage of the dead, and since the Vorath controlled 6 of the 12 senior seats on the Galactic Compact's governing board, what the Vorath believed tended to become policy for everyone else in the building. Nadia was not supposed to be moving. She was a junior communications clerk assigned to the human delegation, and her job during Vorath morning periods was to sit at her desk, keep her equipment on standby, and make no sound. She had been doing exactly that for 11 hours when the signal arrived on the encrypted human diplomatic channel. Not a voice message, not a text, just a single repeating pulse. Short, long, short. 3 times. Then nothing. She knew what it meant. She had been told what it meant 8 months ago, in a briefing she had attended along with 12 other junior staff, held in a room with no recording devices, and a very specific instruction to forget the meeting had happened if anyone ever asked. Short, long, short meant the vote had passed. She sat very still for another 4 minutes, which was how long it took her to decide whether she was going to do what she had been told to do if this moment ever came. Then she opened a drawer in her desk, took out a small device that was not standard diplomatic equipment, and connected it to the communication array. The device sent a compressed data burst on a frequency that the Compact's monitoring systems had never logged, because it had been built specifically to sit between 2 registered bands, close enough to look like interference, gone before any analysis could confirm otherwise. The burst took 0.3 seconds to transmit. It contained, in a format that would mean nothing to any Compact technician, the current positions of every human diplomatic vessel in Compact-monitored space, updated with today's date. Then she put the device back in the drawer, folded her hands on her desk, and sat in the required silence. 2 corridors away, the Vorath ambassador to the Compact was being carried to his final rest by 6 honor guards in gray ceremonial armor, and the Grand Assembly Chamber was playing a low harmonic tone that the Vorath considered appropriate for grief. Nadia considered that the timing was almost poetic. The Compact had just voted to remove humanity from the only interstellar government in the known galaxy, and they had done it during 3 days when no one was allowed to make any noise about it. She wondered if Yale had planned for that too. She decided probably yes. Yale had planned for most things. The vote itself had taken 4 hours. Nadia had watched it on her desk terminal, sound off out of respect for the morning period, closed captions scrolling in 6 languages simultaneously. She had watched the tally board fill with pale green yes votes, species after species, some of them civilizations that humanity had traded with for decades, some of them cultures that had sent medical researchers to human colony worlds during the plague years, and accepted human engineers in return during their own infrastructure crises. They had all voted yes. The charges were the same charges that had been building in Compact records for 30 years. Humans were difficult. They did not follow protocols when the protocols conflicted with what they thought was right. They made friends with species they were not supposed to make friends with. They shared technology through channels that were not officially sanctioned. They argued with their own delegation leadership in public, which the Compact considered undignified. They cried at trade summits. They brought food to every meeting and insisted on sharing it, which several species found presumptuous, and 2 species found genuinely moving. They were, in the formal language of the exile motion, insufficiently governable. Nadia had read that phrase the first time and laughed so hard she had to put her face in her hands. Insufficiently governable, as if it were a defect, as if the species that had survived their own world, built ships from nothing, crossed the stars arguing the whole way, and still somehow kept showing up to help whoever needed it most, as if those people were the problem. She looked at the tally board one more time, Final count, the Exile was passed. She thought about the briefing 8 months ago, about the room with no recording devices, about Yale standing at the front with a map of the outer rim on the display behind her, and a very calm voice explaining that the compact had been moving toward this for years, and that the only question was whether humanity would be caught off guard by it or not. They had not been caught off guard. Nadia did not know all the details. She knew only her piece, the device in the drawer, the signal to watch for, the burst to send when it came. There were hundreds of people across compact space who knew only their own piece. Yale had been very careful about that. She said it was partly for security, and partly because if everyone knew everything, someone would try to improve it, and improvements introduced by committee during the final stage of a long plan were almost always catastrophic. The harmonic tone in the corridor outside shifted pitch. The mourning period was entering its second phase. Nadia straightened her jacket, checked that the device was properly hidden, and pulled up a standard work report on her terminal so that her screen looked occupied with routine activity. Outside the station, in the cold and the dark and the silence between stars, the first human ships were already moving. Not fast, not in formation. One by one, in ones and twos, taking their time, filing standard departure notices that listed destinations no one would think to check until much later. The compact had voted. Humanity had received the result. Now came the part where humanity did what it had always done when a door closed in its face. It went and found a different building. The leaders voted to exile Earth. Humanity left before the vote was over. Nobody noticed the gardens were gone until the third day. That was the thing about human additions to compact stations. They accumulated so slowly, so quietly, that the other species who lived and worked in those spaces stopped registering them as human things and started registering them as just things. The small planter boxes mounted along the corridor walls in the habitat ring. The water feature in the common area that recycled condensation from the atmospheric system and ran it over smooth stones into a basin. The 2 fruit trees in the secondary cafeteria, growing in sealed soil containers under a specific light spectrum that someone had calibrated to match Earth's afternoon sun. All of it was gone. Not damaged, not removed messily, just gone, as if it had been packed with care and taken by people who knew exactly what they were taking and had plenty of time to do it properly. Investigator Goss discovered the missing gardens while walking to his office on the morning of the third day after the exile vote. He was Drac, broad, blue-skinned, four-armed, with the patient and slightly sorrowful disposition that many Drac developed after long careers in institutions where things were always more complicated than they should have been. He had worked internal security for the Compact's main diplomatic station for 19 years. He had seen everything, or so he had believed until he turned the corner into Corridor 7 of the habitat ring and found bare wall brackets where the planter boxes had been. He stopped. He looked at the brackets. He looked at the clean wall behind them, where the paint was very slightly less faded than the surrounding surface. A difference visible only because the plants had been blocking that section from the corridor's ambient light for what must have been several years. He went to his office and pulled the station's internal movement logs. The logs showed nothing unusual. Standard foot traffic, standard cargo movements, standard maintenance cycles. Nothing flagged, nothing irregular. He expanded the search window to the 7 days before the vote and found the same picture, a station operating in its normal rhythms. He pulled the external dock logs and found 19 human-registered vessels had departed in the same 7-day window, all with valid clearances, all with standard cargo declarations. None of them listed passengers. None of them listed personal effects. Goss looked at the cargo declarations for a long time. Then he looked at the weight manifests. The declared cargo weights matched the manifests exactly, which was unusual in his experience, Most cargo runs had minor discrepancies between what was declared and what was actually loaded, because loading was done by people, and people were imprecise. These manifests were perfect, every number matched, every container accounted for. He thought about that, about the kind of careful that produced perfect numbers on a manifest, about people who had known in advance exactly what they were moving, who had weighed and documented and logged it all meticulously, who had wanted the departure record to show nothing unusual enough to flag. He put in a search across all compact monitored stations for similar departure patterns in the past 8 months. The results came back in 11 minutes. He read them for considerably longer. 47 stations, hundreds of departures, human vessels all properly cleared, all filed on time, all with manifests that were just slightly too clean. And from every station the same quiet disappearance of the small human things, the planters, the decorations, the shared spaces that humans had customized over years of habitation. Gone carefully, gone without announcement. He filed an urgent report to his department head, and then sat in his office for a while, thinking about what the report actually meant. It meant the humans had not left because the compact exiled them. It meant the humans had been leaving for months. The exile vote had simply been the signal for the last ones to go. He thought about a conversation he had once had with a human maintenance worker named Petra, who had worked on the station's water recycling system for 6 years. She had been, in his assessment, the most competent person working on that system, human or otherwise. She had once explained to him, during a repair she was doing in the corridor outside his office, that the best way to fix a system that was going to fail was to start building the replacement before the failure happened, not after. He had thought she was talking about the water recycler. He pulled Petra's personnel file. Departure date logged 4 months ago. Destination listed as personal travel. No further record. He thought about the fruit trees in the secondary cafeteria. He had eaten lunch near those trees perhaps 300 times. He had not known, until today, that he had noticed them enough to miss them. His department head responded to the report with a single line: confirm scope and escalate to fleet coordination. Goss wrote back that the scope was, to his best estimate, total. Every human who had been living and working on compact stations had left, or was in the process of leaving, in an operation that had been running for the better part of a year with no detection, because it had been designed to look like nothing at all. He sent the message. Then he went back to Corridor 7 and looked at the bare brackets on the wall again. Someone had built those planter boxes into the bracket mounts with the kind of careful joinery that made them look like a permanent installation. But when you looked at the brackets closely, the way Goss was looking at them now, you could see that the mounting was designed to release cleanly. No permanent adhesive, no welded joints, just a very secure temporary fit that would hold for years and come apart in minutes if you knew how. They had always been planning to take them with them. They had just also been, in the meantime, growing things in them. That was the part Goss found hardest to explain in his report. The humans had been preparing to leave for months, possibly years. And while they were preparing, they had still planted things. They had still put water features in common areas and fruit trees in cafeterias and decorated shared spaces for the benefit of everyone who used them, knowing they would eventually pack it all up and go. He did not have a category in his security framework for that particular combination of behaviors. He wrote in his report that the full implications were still being assessed. He was not sure they could be. The leaders voted to exile Earth. Humanity left before the vote was over. The Mevin children had started calling it the Singing Wall, and nobody had the heart to tell them to stop. It was not actually a wall. It was the outer hull section of Human Station 7 in the drift, where someone nobody seemed to know exactly who or when, had installed a series of resonance chambers along the exterior plating. When the solar wind from the orange star ran at a certain speed, which it did for about 3 hours every 32 days, The chambers caught it and turned it into something that was not quite music but was not music either. A deep, low, shifting sound that moved through the hull and into the floors and up through your feet if you were standing in the right corridor. The Mevin, who experienced sound through vibration-sensitive structures along their lower limbs, found it extraordinary. The adults used measured scientific language about it. The children just pressed their feet flat to the floor and stood very still with their eyes closed. There were 61 Mevin in the drift now. Not representatives, not diplomats, just people, engineers mostly, a few educators, 2 families with children, who had resigned their compact positions or ended their contracts and come to a place that was not on any official map, because it seemed like the kind of place where things were actually being done. Petra was the one who had told them about it. Petra had worked water recycling systems on compact stations for 6 years, before coming to the drift 14 months ago. She was a short, quiet human woman with the practical hands of someone who fixed things for a living, and the habit of explaining complex systems in very small words. On the compact stations, she had worked alongside Mevin engineers regularly. They were good at small, detailed work, and she was good at large system logic, and they had developed a professional shorthand that crossed the species barrier more smoothly than most diplomatic frameworks managed. When she had left, she had told 3 of her Mevin colleagues where she was going. Not officially, just a set of coordinates and a fold jump calculation, passed in a personal message that looked like a recipe file, because they had spent enough time together that they had learned how to talk to each other without being understood by anyone else. 2 of the 3 had followed within the month. The third had taken a year to finish his contract obligations, tie up his affairs, and arrange things so that his departure did not leave the compact's atmospheric maintenance division short-staffed in a way that would hurt anyone. His name was Set, and he was the most conscientious person Petra had ever worked with, which she meant as the highest possible compliment. Set was now running the atmospheric systems for 4 of the drift's newer station sections, and he had recruited the 2 families friends of his, both with children old enough to need a real school rather than a data pad, because the drift school had been asking for more teachers, and one of the parents was an educator. This was how the drift grew, not through announcements, not through formal offers or recruitment drives, through people telling other people, quietly and specifically, that there was a place doing real work that needed what those people knew how to do. Nadia arrived on a cargo transfer 3 weeks after sending the final signal from the diplomatic station. She had not rushed. She had finished her last week of work, submitted her final reports, and resigned her position through the standard process, citing personal reasons, which was allowed. She had taken her personal belongings, which were not many. She had left everything that belonged to the compact in the condition she had found it. Petra was waiting at the docking gate. They had never met in person, only in the briefing 8 months ago where Nadia had been given her specific role and her specific device. But Petra had a way of making you feel like you had known her longer than you had, which was a human quality that Nadia had read about in the cultural briefings she had ignored for the first 5 years of her diplomatic career, and started paying close attention to after she understood what she was actually part of. Petra gave her a tour that took 4 hours and covered maybe a third of the inhabited sections. The drift was larger than Nadia had imagined from the data she had seen. Not large in the way compact stations were large, not built from endless budget and political will and the architecture of power. Large in the way that a thing gets large when a lot of people need it to be, and so they keep adding to it. There were sections that were beautifully engineered, and sections that were clearly built in a hurry by people who were good at adapting on the fly. There were corridors that connected at slightly wrong angles because 2 teams had been building toward each other from different starting points and had met in the middle a few meters off from where they expected. In the common areas, there were plants, not grand installations, small ones, practical ones, herb boxes that contributed to the food supply, A row of flowering things near the main junction that someone had grown from seeds brought from a colony world. In the cafeteria of Station 4, two fruit trees stood under a specialized light array, their roots in sealed soil containers, producing actual fruit at a rate that was not commercially meaningful, but was personally significant to the people who picked it. Nadia recognized the trees. She had seen their siblings in a compact station cafeteria 2 years ago, before they were packed up and moved here. She stood in front of them for a long moment. Set came into the cafeteria while she was standing there. He was carrying a diagnostic tool and a cup of something warm. He stopped when he saw her looking at the trees, and then he came and stood beside her and looked at them too. He said, in Standard, that he had been uncertain about many things when he decided to come here. He said he had made a list of the reasons it was a good idea and a list of the reasons it was a very serious risk, and for a long time the two lists had been roughly equal. Nadia asked what had finally made the difference. Set was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had asked himself which list was about fear and which list was about the actual future. He said most of the reasons it was a risk list turned out to be fear when he looked at it honestly, and the reasons it was a good idea list was almost entirely about what he thought the actual future could be. Then he went to check the atmospheric readings for Section 4. Nadia stayed by the trees a little longer. Through the viewport beside the cafeteria, the orange star gave its dim and constant light. In the corridor outside, she could faintly feel, through the soles of her shoes, the solar wind running at the right speed. The singing wall was singing. The leaders voted to exile Earth. Humanity left before the vote was over. The compact sent a researcher before it sent a fleet. Her name was Voss. She was Shen, the same quiet reptilian species as Orvin, the delegate who had voted no, and she worked for a division of the compact called the Cultural Continuity Office, which studied civilizations that were in the process of significant change. The CCO had a mandate to observe and document rather than intervene, which made it one of the few compact institutions that Voss found genuinely useful. She had been following the human situation for 3 years. Not officially. Officially, her portfolio covered a slow-moving study of post-migration settlement patterns in the mid-rim. Unofficially, she had started filling a secondary research file with everything she could find about humans after attending a conference where a compact economist had presented data on border world trade patterns and had mentioned, almost as a footnote, that human-facilitated trade moved significantly faster and with significantly higher survival rates than standard compact brokered exchanges, and nobody had been able to fully explain why. Voss had found that interesting enough to lose sleep over. She had applied for research clearance to the drift through a channel that did not technically require the Fleet Coordination Office to approve it, which was the kind of procedural gap that only existed because no one had imagined it would ever be needed. The approval came back in 4 days. She took a small transport ship, filed a standard research visit designation, and arrived at the drift's main docking arm on a quiet shift change. Nobody stopped her. A human docking coordinator named Farrell checked her clearance, asked if she had specific atmospheric requirements, and then gave her a visitor access card and pointed her toward the common areas. She spent the first day just walking. The drift was unlike anything in the compact's records of independent settlements. Most species, when they broke from a governing structure, defaulted to one of two patterns. They either built something that mimicked the structure they had left, because it was what they knew, or they built something reactively opposite to it, as a statement. The drift was neither. It had the feeling of a place that had been built by people who had simply asked what they needed, and then built that, without spending much energy on what it was supposed to look like from the outside. The corridor signage was in 7 languages, 3 of which were not human. The cafeteria menus had symbols she did not recognize until she realized they were dietary notation for Mevin protein sensitivities. In the medical bay, which she passed and did not enter, simply looking through the open doorway. She counted 3 different species working alongside human medical staff, and none of them appeared to be there in any official capacity. They just appeared to be there. She requested an interview with whoever was available to speak with a researcher. She was directed to a woman named Yale. Yale worked in what the Drift called the Coordination Hub, a large open room full of screens and people talking, and a constant low noise of activity that felt purposeful rather than chaotic. She was lean and quick-eyed, and she had the manner of someone who was always running 3 calculations in parallel, and had long since made peace with the fact that this was simply how her mind worked. She agreed to an interview with the directness of someone who had no reason not to. Voss asked how the Drift made decisions. Yale said it depended on the kind of decision. Small operational decisions were made by whoever was responsible for the relevant system. Large structural decisions went to the rotating council. Emergency decisions went to whoever was present and most qualified, and were reviewed by the council afterward. She said the system had problems, and they were actively working on the problems, and they had a standing meeting every 20 days specifically for finding new problems before they became crises. Voss asked who had designed the system. Yale said nobody had designed it whole. It had been assembled from parts, some of it borrowed from how human cooperative settlements had governed themselves historically, some of it invented on the spot when the invented-on-the-spot version turned out to work better than anything they had planned. She said the water system management structure had come from a colony World's Drought Committee model that had been running for 60 years. She said the emergency decision protocol had come from a Mevan engineer named Set, who had noticed a gap in their original plan and filled it. Voss asked whether it concerned her that the system was not fully designed, that it was still evolving. Yale looked at her with an expression that was not unfriendly but was very direct. She said that fully designed systems did not adapt. She said the Compact had very fully designed systems, and when the systems encountered situations they had not been designed for, they produced 14-month review periods and committee reports. She said she had read enough of those reports in her career to have a firm opinion about their value. Voss wrote this down. She wrote down most of what Yale said because it had the quality of things that would mean more later than they meant now. She asked at the end of the interview whether the humans were afraid. Yale was quiet for a moment. Then she said she thought fear was the wrong frame. She said the people who had come to the Drift had all, in their own ways, already made the decision that the worst outcome was not failing here. The worst outcome was succeeding at being something they did not want to be. She said when you had that clarity, fear became mostly logistical. You were still afraid of specific things, a failing water system, a medical supply shortage, a structural fault in the newer sections. But you were not afraid of the fundamental situation, because the fundamental situation was one you had chosen. Voss thanked her and spent 3 more days walking through the Drift, taking notes. On her last morning, she stood at the observation window near the docking arm and watched the station's outer construction team working on a new section, small figures in suits against the orange-lit hull, moving with the particular efficiency of people doing work they had done many times. A Mevan engineer in a pale gray suit worked alongside 2 humans, their movements coordinated in the easy way of people who had developed a working language between them that did not require translation. She filed her research report from the transport ship on the way back to compact space. It was long and detailed and contained a great deal of data. The conclusion was 2 sentences. The free assembly of humanity is not in distress. It is in the early stage of becoming something the Compact does not have a category for, and the category will probably need to be invented. The leaders voted to exile Earth. Humanity left before the vote was over. The crisis started with a fungus. Not a human fungus, and not on a human world. The Vel were a quiet, slow-moving species from a cold, damp planet in the mid-rim, large, gray, vaguely crustacean in appearance, with a communication style that relied heavily on color shifts across their outer membrane rather than sound. They were not compact members. They had been offered membership twice and declined both times, which the compact had recorded as developmental primitivity, and Voss, reading the same records, had recorded as a reasonable preference for being left alone. A fast-spreading blight had reached their agricultural networks, a fungal variant that attacked the particular root systems the Vel used for 80% of their food production. The Vel did not have the research infrastructure to identify and counter it quickly. The Compact's Agricultural Aid Division received a distress signal, filed it for review, and opened an assessment request that would take, under standard procedure, somewhere between 4 and 8 months to resolve. The signal was on an open frequency. A human hauler named Dara picked it up 3 days after it was filed. She was not an agricultural specialist. She was not a diplomat or a scientist or an aid worker with an organization behind her. She was a freight hauler running a supply route between 3 drift stations and an outer rim waypoint, and she happened to be passing through the frequency range, where the Vel signal was broadcasting, when her navigation system flagged it as a non-standard transmission. She listened to it. The translation was rough. The Vel's color-based communication did not convert cleanly to audio, but the core information was clear enough. Food system failing, population at risk, help requested. She opened her comm and called the Drift's coordination hub. Yale answered. Dara read her the key points of the signal. There was a pause of about 4 seconds, which was Yale running the logistics. Then Yale said she would make some calls and asked Dara to hold the frequency. 40 minutes later, Dara had a new route. She was not going alone. 2 other haulers who had been running nearby routes redirected to join her, one carrying general supplies who offloaded half her cargo at a waypoint to make room for an emergency food pack, one who was running empty on a return leg and could carry whatever was most needed. From the drift, a medical researcher named Hana was added to Dara's ship. She was not an agricultural specialist either, but she had deep cross-species biology training and had worked with fungal infections in different ecosystems. And Set, who had contacts in the Mevan scientific community, sent a 6-hour burst message to a Mevan mycology researcher he had worked with on a previous project, who replied within the hour with a compressed research file on fungal variants in cold climate root systems, and a list of treatment compounds that could be synthesized from materials that were likely available in the Vel's own ecosystem. The 3 ships arrived at the Vel homeworld 11 days after Dara first heard the signal. The Vel were not prepared for them. They had received the Compact's acknowledgement of their distress signal, a formal notice that the assessment was in progress, and had been managing the situation with their own limited resources. When 3 ships from a place called the Free Assembly of Humanity appeared in their orbital space, the Vel's outer monitoring stations sent a query that translated, roughly, as "Who are you and why are you here?" Dara replied that they had heard the signal and had some things that might help and asked if they could come down. There was a long pause from the Vel side, then a response that the translation system rendered as "You may approach." What followed was 6 weeks that Dara had not planned for and would spend the rest of her life thinking about. Hana worked with the Vel's own knowledge keepers, elderly Vel who carried generations of agricultural understanding in their community memory, to identify which of the Mevan researchers' treatment compounds matched materials already present in the Vel ecosystem. The answer was most of them, which was the kind of thing that happened when you approached a problem by asking what was already there rather than what you could import. The hauler who had been running empty made 2 more trips, back to the drift for specific equipment, back to the Vel with it. The other hauler stayed on site and helped with distribution, which turned out to require understanding the Vel's color-based communication well enough to coordinate across their agricultural network. The pilot, a human man named Goran, spent the first 2 weeks making significant mistakes in Vel color language, and the next 4 weeks making progressively fewer. And by the end, He could hold a basic field coordination conversation in membrane shift that made the Vel agricultural teams display the color the translation team said meant something like relieved. The Compact's assessment arrived during week 4. It was thorough, professionally written, and recommended a course of action that was largely what Hana and the Vel knowledge keepers had already implemented. It also noted that the affected region's situation appeared to have stabilized, which it attributed to the resilience of local agricultural practices. Nobody from the Compact mentioned the 3 ships. When Dara's team finally departed, the Vel Outer Monitoring Station broadcast a transmission in audio format, unusual for the Vel, which the team's translation system noted as a specific choice, a deliberate use of a non-native communication mode to make sure the message was received clearly. The message was short. It said the Vel did not join things, as a general principle, but if the free assembly of humanity had a frequency they monitored, the Vel would like to have it. Dara sent them the frequency. Back at the Drift, Yale added a new entry to the Coordination Hub's contact directory. She did not file it under any special category. She just added it to the list, alphabetically, the same as everything else. In the cafeteria of Station 4, Set was eating lunch near the fruit trees. He had received a message from the Mevin mycology researcher, a colleague he had worked with for years under the Compact's institutional framework, who had provided the critical research file in a 6-hour burst because Set had asked, and because the work was real and the need was urgent. The message said that the researcher had been thinking for some time about certain things, that she had a family, that her youngest was almost grown, that she had colleagues who felt the same way. She wanted to know if the Drift had need of a mycologist. Set finished his lunch. He sent a reply. It said yes, there was need, and the atmospheric system on Section 7 needed work, and the fruit trees in the cafeteria were doing well, and she should bring warm clothes because the outer sections ran cold until the insulation was improved. He said they were working on the insulation. The leaders voted to exile Earth. Humanity left before the vote was over. The Compact's problem in the end was not that the humans had left. The problem was the questions. They started small. A Mevin trade coordinator filed an internal query asking whether the Free Assembly's non-compact status affected the validity of technical certifications issued by assembly engineers. Because 3 assembly engineers had done repair work on a Mevin station's atmospheric system, and the work was excellent, and the certifications did not exist in any compact registry, and the coordinator needed to know how to file the paperwork. The query went up the chain and came back 4 weeks later with a response that said the situation required further review. The coordinator noted that the atmospheric system had needed to work during those 4 weeks and had in fact worked, and filed the query again with that observation appended. Then a Vel communications delegation, the first official Vel diplomatic contact in recorded history, which should have been a significant moment of celebration in compact records, arrived at the Midrim station and requested a meeting that was not with any compact representative, but was specifically with someone from the Free Assembly of Humanity. The Vel said they wanted to discuss frequency-sharing protocols. The Compact's diplomatic office asked whether they had considered full membership. The Vel said they had considered it, and no. And could someone please tell them how to reach the Free Assembly? Then Goss, the Drac security investigator who had first noticed the missing garden plants, submitted a report to his department that went considerably further than his job description technically required. He had spent months reviewing the pattern of human activity across compact stations in the years before the departure, the informal networks, the interspecies working relationships, the technical knowledge shared through personal connections across species lines. Border communities with high human presence over the previous decade showed faster resolution of infrastructure problems, higher rates of cross-species technical collaboration, and measurably better outcomes during shortage events. Not because of any official human program, just because humans had been there, doing what humans did, talking to whoever was around, sharing what they knew, asking for help when they needed it, and giving it when they could. The report landed on the desk of a senior compact administrator named Wen. She read it twice and sat in her office for a long time thinking about the implications of her own institution's decision to remove that particular variable from the equation. She sent Goss a message saying his work was thorough and she was forwarding it to the Policy Review Board. Goss replied that he appreciated it and asked if she wanted him to continue the analysis. She said yes. In the Grand Assembly, Sitha was dealing with a procedural problem she had not anticipated. The Exile framework required ongoing monitoring of the exiled party, confirmation they were operating within designated boundaries and in compliance with trade restrictions. This monitoring required knowing where the exiled party was, which required them to be in contact with compact monitoring systems, which the Free Assembly was not. The Assembly was broadcasting its position openly, but that was not the same as participating in official systems, and Sitha's legal team had spent 6 weeks trying to determine whether open broadcasting satisfied the monitoring requirement, and had arrived at the conclusion that it was genuinely unclear. She did not like unclear. She called her legal team to a meeting and told them she needed a clear answer. They told her that in order to get one, they would need to establish a communication channel with the Free Assembly, which would require the compact to initiate contact on a basis that acknowledged the Assembly's operational existence. She asked if that was a problem legally. They said it was not. She asked why they had not done it already. The most senior one said it had not been clear whether she wanted that contact initiated. Sitha said she was making it clear now. The first formal compact to Assembly communication in 8 months went out on a standard diplomatic channel, procedural in tone, a request to clarify monitoring compliance, signed by Sitha's office. Yale received it in the coordination hub. She read it twice. Then she walked to the small side room where Nadia had set up her communication station. Nadia was now officially the Drift's external communications lead, a job that had not existed 4 months ago, which she was performing with the precision of someone who had spent years learning how official communications worked and could now apply that knowledge to something she actually believed in. Yale handed her the message. Nadia read it and said it was a start. Yale agreed. Then she said that the Section 9 water pressure problem had gotten worse overnight, and the repair team needed someone to authorize a supply draw from the emergency reserves. And could Nadia also handle the reply to the VEL frequency share request before the end of the day, because the VEL monitoring schedule ran on a short cycle, and they did not like being kept waiting. Nadia said yes to all of it. Outside, in the Drift's slow orbit around the orange star, the construction team was finishing the framing on the new residential section, the one that would house the Mevin mycologist when she arrived, and her family, and the 6 people she had mentioned in a second message who were also thinking about certain things and would probably follow. Dara was on approach. Her route now covered 23 stations and 4 non-compact communities, including the VEL. She had learned over the past month to read basic VEL color signal through a modified scanner that Hana had calibrated for her ship's display. She was not fluent. She could manage coordinates, status reports, and the particular color that meant all is well, which the VEL produced in a specific warm amber that her scanner rendered on her navigation display, and which she had come to find, on long quiet runs through the dark between stars, quietly reassuring. She brought her ship in on the standard approach lane. The docking coordinator gave her the berth assignment and the warm frequency welcome ping. She docked. She had 3 deliveries and 1 pickup and a maintenance check to schedule, and if she had time, she was going to go sit near the fruit trees in the cafeteria for a while. The compact had voted to exile Earth. Humanity had left before they finished counting. And out here, in the orange light of a small and unremarkable star, in a place that was not on any official map and did not need to be. The work continued. Water pressure checks and mycology files, and Vel color frequencies and fruit trees growing in sealed soil containers. Ordinary and endless, and in the way of all things built by people who meant it, surprisingly hard to stop.